I'm Reverend Jude Geiger, joined with Brother Zachary from Community Church, a Franciscan priest. And we're here for Roots to Leaves, looking at the history of Unitarianism, Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism in conversation with Catholic identity and integrity and ethics. And this week we're looking at our seventh principle, which is where we understand that we're covenanting to affirm and promote the interdependent web of life of which we're a part. In our last episode, we talked about it from the environmental or the natural perspective. And although humans are part of environment and nature, we'll be looking a little bit today more at the human side of that equation. And I'm thinking heavily right now from Thoreau to New York City. Walden Pond was written, and it's sort of a libertarian philosophical, often gets grabbed as a libertarian ideal, being away on your own, pristine nature, looking at the beauty and all the wisdom. And there's so much in the transcendentalist movement that is so super positive. And there's also the background context that Thoreau is writing about 3 miles from his childhood home, and his mom and sisters were doing his laundry and cooking meals for him. And I remember that always when we talk about we're our own man, that old kind of language. And Brother Zachary and I are working and living and doing ministry in New York City, as far from Walden Pond as I could imagine. And that's what we're talking about today. Brother Zachary, before we began recording, you mentioned a little bit about some of the common ethic that you and I talked about in the past multiple times in Catholicism and the language of the body of Christ. And I'd be curious about your take on that in this kind of framed context today.
Yes, thank you, Reverend Jude. And I absolutely love your introduction to this conversation. I think Thoreau is a useful window into how interdependence functions in our world. And I love the anecdote that you shared about the way that we frame it almost as a libertarian ethos on Walden Pond. And yet, as he was writing, his mother and sisters were tending to him and caring for his needs behind the surface. And I think it's easy for us as individuals to forget how much care a person requires. All people require care. We have to care for ourselves. And likewise, we're not able to fully care for ourselves. And I say that as in a general way, but from a Catholic perspective, you can see how that functions in the theology of the body of Christ. We've discussed this in other ways, and I don't need to belabor the theological principle, but in Catholic community, we have this idea that God really moves through people, that people are the agents of God in the world. And through our faith and through our relationship to one another in spiritual community, and through our expressions of justice seeking or of charity, we become the vehicle by which God can move the world. It's less of a spiritual and metaphysical paradox to talk about God's presence in the world as a Catholic, and more about what it is that we as flesh and blood human beings have a responsibility to do and become for one another. I love the way you framed our conversation and the perspective that I tried to bring, because integrity, that you use the word integrity, and I think that integrity forms so much of the Catholic conscience. How do I be myself and yet also represent God in the world?
Ooh. In Unitarian Universalism, some of us will use that same language you just said and have no edits, and others will hearken back to sort of character that's embedded in our around 1800 with Channing, salvation through character, and the idea was that we develop a real sense of integrity in relationship to the world we're around. And sometimes you look back at it and it can be seen as individual character, which is part of, we're all individuals.
Mm.
And that doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are educators and mentors, teachers, parents, that get us to a place where we can then give back, either to those younger or those older. I mean, you can be a mentor at any age to any age,
Mm.
and it's always in relationship. It's never singular.
Mm.
No one appeared uh, in air. None of us were born by our own efforts.
That's so true. And what an important, I think, symbol for interdependence we can lean into. Not a one of us, as babies, could have entered into this world without the assistance of other humans. It requires, we owe our existence in the world to the presence of other people. We didn't get to where we are alone. And I think despite this, especially in this country, and I can't speak to any other cultural context, we seem so beholden to an individualistic concept of what it means to be human. And it's almost a cosmological loneliness that we suffer, believing that a person is by themselves. And it's I feel that tension in religious community, and yet I also, despite my faith, despite my intentions, despite my urgent plea to others that we are dependent on one another and we need to lean into it, I still feel that loneliness sometimes. I still feel this worldview of disconnection, of individual responsibility. And I think that it's it's so important for us to recognize ourselves as relational primarily, and the evidence for that doesn't come from the inside. It comes from relationship. There's a paradox there. We To see ourselves relationally, we have to engage in relationship. Um, and I think that's a little bit of where Thoreau misses the mark in leaning into the pristine beauty of natural contexts, that it misses the responsibility that human communities have to participate in that natural beauty.
And to be fair, the Transcendentalists as a movement, which he was a part, applied that philosophy in the natural world, in the human world,
Mm,
in social justice work, in peace movements, anti-war movements. It just, when it gets dumbed down to be the self-made man at a lake, that the wider context is lost,
mm,
and then you have trite philosophical memes out there, that somehow, we're going to put the fire out in our house without a fire truck and a whole fire department. No, we're not. We're going to need help.
mm.
We're not doing it on our own. Uh, and that often, I think, is a part that our Unitarian Universalist theology demands of us, to remember that in all cases, you are not doing this alone. So there are ethical obligations to it. It's not just sort of an airy-fairy thing. It's not a philosophy. Not that there's anything wrong with airy or fairy. I'm pro-fairy.
I want to agree with you. And for me, I really connect with this idea that we're not doing anything in a vacuum. And even our individual efforts are part of a larger project, part of a larger system. I can't speak to other times in the world, but I'm speaking now in the year 2024. There's a great deal of interconnection that is obvious and visible in the ways that we live our life. If I choose, to engage in particularly destructive practices, or, if I throw away a great deal of paper and plastic, I have the resources now to know that that will negatively impact our world. Um, our producer, in helping to prepare this conversation, shared a particular example. If I run my air conditioner all summer long and all night all summer, we can see the direct impact that has on climate refugees. It's a specific relationship. Those relationships, I imagine, are more visible in our world today than they have been in other times. But there's that fundamental interconnection between people is something that it requires a willful ignorance not to engage or experience.
It's interesting. I agree. Every little action we take in the world, particularly around environment, has an impact. And the vast majority of the environmental crisis is predicated on a consumer culture that really is a few people on the planet changing policies and politics to do wide scale devastation for personal gain.
Mm.
It's that predication is the billionaire psychosis, the dragon on the mound of gold. None of that's real. Money isn't real, although the impacts of it are tremendously real. It's all sort of a social agreement we have with each other. And that's also sort of in the American political sphere. Again, libertarianism, as if Elon Musk didn't inherit blood diamond money. He somehow magically did all this on his own.
Mm. Mm.
But we can just go track through history to see how these accumulations, whether him or the King of England, whatever range you want to go in, and all of those statements are complicated. And they're true. Uh, Elon didn't earn his money, and what he does with it, he gets to do with it because we stick with certain old rules around how humanity works with each other. That's incredibly toxic and incredibly damaging. Even the idea that if I just recycle a little bit more, and I'm that Gen X kid, I
Mm.
was arguing to have recycling put into our schools. When I was a grade schooler, and I still recycle and all of that. Uh, and that's not really the source of the problem. The problem is sourced in a fundamental lack of awareness of our interdependence.
I'm so inspired by your re-clarifying, Reverend Jude, because you're exactly right. We're living in a context, I think, that magnifies these concepts of individual responsibility in such a way as to obscure what is happening on a wide scale. And you really put your finger on it, that a few powerful individuals have the capacity to reap large scale destruction and are not held to accountability. There's an aspect of interdependence that is broken in this system, that these individuals who, seeking personal gain, have the capacity to reap large scale destruction are acting as if that impact were not so traumatizing and destructive. And so I think the task for us, in some ways, as a globalized people, um, I think is how do we engage these, frankly, bullies, we'll call them, folks who want to push ahead at the expense of other people, trying to seek some personal gain. Ultimately, we've reached, I think, the limit of what individual freedoms, our world and our mixture of cultures have the capacity to endure. We simply can't endure it as a world anymore. This new shift that needs to be made globally, it sure looks like has to include a cap on bullying and a cap on expansion. These two factors threaten the interdependent web of humankind.
I think bullying is a gentle way of saying it.
Mm.
There's the stuff we're seeing on the ground. You use the word accountability. I think that is the buzzword for what we desperately need in 2024. That aversion on the ground to anyone being asked or made to feel accountable for their actions is a rallying cry to keep the status quo for the few.
Mm.
have inherited generational wealth that was extractive of both people and the environment. And we don't, as long as we keep on the ground talking about if someone was canceled, or are they really accountable, or are they called in or called out, we're actually not changing the extractive nature of our economy or our politics or our philosophy. And we need to do both. We need to handle on the ground the people who feel like ever being corrected for bad will or bad efforts is somehow an antagonism to their personal freedom,
Mm,
i.e., anarchy, not liberty.
mm,
We have to do that. And it's a smokescreen
mm,
for folks who are directly linked to devastation and human devastation. I mean, Elon Musk, they're voting this week on stakeholders giving him a $56 billion bonus when he laid off 1,700 tech people,
mm,
right? And I don't know what that math is. How many $1 million a person could have, that person, those jobs could have been saved, but they needed to extract that livelihood to benefit one person with the amount of money that could never be spent in a lifetime. So we gave up going to the moon in the 60s, but one individual citizen can shoot out into space
mm.
for, for so that we need to have dragons on hordes.
Mm. Reverend Jude, you are speaking prophetically. I hear the passion in particular in how offensive it is to see people treat our world and each other with such reckless disregard. I'm thinking about the closed system of a company and what it means for an individual to seek multi-million dollar bonuses while removing the livelihood from numerous other individuals. That's not a way to keep a system functioning well. Um,
Yeah.
I'm thinking also about the sense of antagonism that you describe some individuals feel when asked to be responsible for one another. That it's an affront to liberty to suggest that we're responsible for each other and responsible for our behavior. That fragility, I think, is part of the problem. We aren't capable of withstanding um, the sharp pain of feeling guilty or responsible or accountable for bad behavior. As a result, we do the emotional or moral equivalent of sticking our fingers in our ears and pretending that we don't notice. That's hard to maintain. I think as we, both as individuals, but as a culture, as a society, improve our capacity to look at ourselves, to see how it is that we perpetuate these wider systems, we might improve our capacity to respond, to meet what it is that our world needs. It's important that we not lean in, like you're saying, to this individual responsibility that looks like it does in the recycling movement. As individuals, we're not capable of simply changing our lifestyle and thus changing the world. That's a simplistic way of thinking about it. But I also hear, Reverend Jude, this individual responsibility that comes from recognizing our interdependence. I think as a member of a religious community, it's easier for me to see that interdependence because of what it's like to seek vulnerability around those who are different. Unitarian Universalism feels unique to me in those ways. As a Catholic, we gather in religious communities, appreciating one another for our differences and for our similarities. The work doesn't end there, however. The work continues as we try to improve our capacity to meet the needs of the world. I noticed that what started as a difference between UUs and Catholics for me feels actually quite similar. Both of us have this need to communally engage the world as it really is.
I think that's spot on. You and I have talked about this before in private conversations, but one of the things that I felt when I found Unitarian Universalism, when I left Catholicism, that felt comfortable to me, even though I'm a theist, and the first congregation I joined was largely atheist, was that they had a Catholic ethic around community. Community transcends individual ego. And that's, in fact, language from the early 1900s from our humanist forebears in the preachers in the Unitarian side of things, Dietrich, Rees, Potter, would call us to remember that the community has to transcend the needs of the individual ego, or what are we doing?
Mm.
And that felt very Catholic to me. That's how I was
It
raised.
sounds very
And
Catholic to me.
and so I think we have a similar ethic. There are points where we've grown in similar ways. Not that that's necessarily a value. I mean, that's a value of Unitarianism in the 1900s, not the 1700s necessarily. And similarly, the Catholic Church has changed over time. I'm remembering right now a conversation in one of our classes at Union Theological Seminary. Brother Zachary and I attended at different times, but we shared a lot of the same faculty. And I remember really having a moment with Professor Gary Dorian when he was casually pointing out in a Christian social ethics class that diversity was a value in the last 50 years. Our forefathers didn't have diversity as a value. It wasn't understood in our national identity that diversity was a positive word. And that's sort of a cultural norm now that is heavily getting pushed back by fascist and white supremacist bad actors in our nation, some at the top. And diversity only happens in community.
Mm.
It only happens when we recognize that we're interdependent, that difference and plurality
Mm.
are human norms and
Mm.
realities, and we can pretend they don't exist, or we can lean into actual human nature.
That's incredible. I love your framing, and I think that recognizing Dr. Dorian's observation that diversity has not been lifted as a value universally, and in fact still isn't, is a very important an important thing, I think, for us to consider. And I think you and I both share the perspective that diversity is a value. We see its value in community. We see its value in our individual lives. And I also experience the discomfort of diversity, being around people who are different, who don't know where I come from, who don't know the influences that I grew up with, who don't know my family or my family history. There is discomfort in our diversity. There is discomfort in being around others who are different from us. That discomfort, however, is not, as most people think of it, a red flag that should move us to seek safety in comfort. I think instead it is a green flag inviting us to experience that discomfort and grow and change in ourselves and around one another. I love also, Reverend Jude, that you have invited Union Theological Seminary into this conversation. I think Union has a particular interpretation as a community of what interdependence looks like, and it has shaped me in my thinking. Maybe as a younger person, I would have interpreted my role in interdependence as one of thinking of myself as really needing to change and improve my own way of relating to the world, but also respecting the difference of those who believe differently and who feel differently. I think as I get older and as I see how dependent our world is on one another, I feel a different responsibility for those who are different than me and those who to those who are different from me. And that responsibility looks like the requirement for me of growing and changing and learning so that I might understand the fullness of what it means to be human. That understanding may never be available to me, yet I think that we have a responsibility to engage with those who are different from us because of how interdependent our world has become.
And on that note, you can't do it by yourself. Amen.
It's true. It's true. We need each other.
This has been a fabulous episode of Roots to Leaves. Thank you so much for joining us on our session looking at the world as it is, interdependently.
Good to be with you. Thank you.